When you think of plants, you don't really think of them as having behavior as far as behavioral ecology because they're not motile organisms. But they really do have similar relationships, similar structures and patterns to motile animals. At the organismal level, it may be very different, but at the cellular level, the processes by which plants and animals perceive environmental changes are equally complex and often homologous. Some of them are more confusing or misunderstood than others, but plants receive specific environmental signals and respond to them in ways that enhance their survival and reproductive success. So example here on the left, the two plants that are circled in blue are the same plant. They are the chameleon vine, and through mechanisms that we still don't fully understand, they are able to alter the size, shape, color, orientation, petiole length, tip shape, all sorts of physical structures in response to what they are growing on. Okay, so there has to be some way that these things are perceiving these signals, likely some sort of volatile or genetic adherence, but plants still do respond to signals. When water enters the seed, the gibberellin hormone activates, amylase digests the sugars, the starches into sugars, and the plant begins to grow. When the Arabidopsis and Arabinopsis, things like tomato plants, are being consumed, some of them have a symbiotic relationship with a parasitoid wasp, which then comes and attacks the predator. So that's going to be that response there. Something like Mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant, will close away in response to the touch of an herbivore, making it look like they've already consumed and increased the survival of the leaves. They do it through a calcium signaling response that is similar to muscle twitch. So these structures exist. Plants do respond to signals, and they have, to some degree, what you could consider behavior. Plants have circadian rhythms. They have chronobiological effects just like animals. Why? Because light is a very common trigger for change, both in plants and in animals. Plants, they have these processes that allow them to synchronize with the light cycle of their surrounding environment, and anticipation of changes in the environment allows appropriate physiological changes, which is an adaptive advantage. We find that it's actually an interconnected feedback loops that are active at different times of the day, basically a morning and an evening loop. And it's different in the shoots and the roots as they respond to different signals because the roots are obviously not exposed to light. So plant circadian rhythms are going to allow it to tell what season it is, when to flower, when to attract pollinators, when to germinate, when to have photosynthetic activity. All sorts of structures are controlled through these processes. They will change their growth patterns in response to light. Okay, here we have the deaviation response, the greening response. So there's photomorphogenesis, which is the light changes, and then there's scotomorphogenesis, which is the dark development. So a potato plant, for example, is going to have very different dark development than light development because the stem growth is going to be looking or sort of pushing through the soil, trying to find light. You're not going to have any chlorophyll, you're not going to have any leaves, you're not really going to have a lot of root because those things are fragile in that underground sort of environment and energy expensive in some cases. So they're using stored energy to do this. And it's only once the light is picked up that transduction and response will lead to the transcription factor activation to produce roots and leaves and all of those other structures. So photomorphogenesis is fairly common. And like chlorophyll, for example, is going to serve no purpose underground as there is no light. So it's a very different response. How do they do this? Well, they use in this case, you see the phytochrome in the center. Phytochrome is one of two major groups, the phytochrome and the cryptochrome. There are also UVB receptors allowing plants to respond to the UV spectrum in ways that we don't really understand fully because we can't see the UV spectrum. Photoperiodism is what we're looking at here. This is going to be when plants have alterations in response to the amount and duration and type of light. Okay, the plants are able to absorb light through these different spectrums, and you can see sort of the rough color spectrum based off of the color of the label in the top. Okay, but alteration of things like chloroplasts and shade alterations, all those sort of structures are going to be part of this process. And it really depends on the red and the far red within these phytochrome types. Basically, uh, we have sort of length of time, but in the 30s we started studying, these are lettuce seeds, and they found that the red and far red and blue lights were the ones that were most responsible for alteration. Red light increased germination, but far red light inhibited it. And it depends on the last flash of light, and it is a reversible process. The PR and the PFR interconvert back and forth. So if seeds, for example, are illuminated with sunlight, the phytochrome is exposed to red light along with other wavelengths, and much of the PR is converted to PFR, triggering germination. Okay, the phytochrome system provides plants with information about the quality of light. It's a reversible process. So, for example, if you have a tree that's being shaded by other trees and requires a high light intensity, the phytochrome ratio will shift to PR because the canopy screens out more red light than far red light. The trees will allocate resources to growing taller rather than branching out. And then once it shifts to PFR, it will start to alter its growth and branch outwards. Okay, so these structures are all interconnected, but light is one of the major alters of plant behavior. Rely on light signals to determine when to switch from the vegetative to the flowering state. This type of photomorphogenesis is known as photoperiodism and involves those red, far red light structures. Basically, you have short day plants and long day plants, and if they have any of that light in that sort of dark period when there shouldn't be, then the short day plants will not flower. But the long day plants will, so long as it's exceeding that critical period. Again, it is the red and the far red that is actually altering this chance. But when you actually graft the plants together, what does this tell me? Well, the long day plant is grafted to the short day plant. We give it short day light and it still flowers. That tells me that this signal is a chemical one that is triggered by light receptors. So it's a lot like cell signaling pathways that you would see in an animal cell. Other responses, other stimuli will have an effect. For example, gravity has an impact. You have the statoliths, a very dense cytoplasmic structure within that will sink to the bottom, and it's not how plants know what is down and what is up. So shoots are going to grow up and roots are going to grow down, which is something that we had to understand a lot when we started trying to grow plants in space, and now we spin them to get that artificial gravity, basically. And some plants will respond to changes in mechanical structure, so basically touch, and that would be a thigmomorphogenesis. So the plant on the far right was in a windy environment, and the one to the left of it was not. So it grew denser, thicker bases to survive the structure there, to survive that wind, basically. You might have plant growth responses in change to chemical structures like nutrient acquisition, uh, geotropism, phototropism, chemotropism. Lots of different structures exist. Environmental stresses like water and salts are another thing that are going to be something that plants need to respond to. And that's going to be through connections in the roots and to the cells, and cells are going to work together to communicate those changes. Some plants are able to respond to that by altering their growth in the so-called flood responses, basically like mangroves, for example. They have these waterlogged soils, so they build these ethylene air tubes inside their structure. It's acting basically like a snorkel, so the plants can take in oxygen even when it's soaked in water. Sodium and certain other ions are toxic at high concentration, so many plants are going to produce organic compounds that keep the water potential of the cells more negative than that of the soil, so they don't intake toxic levels of salts. Most plants can't survive salt stress for a long time, and so that's something that's definitely a survival adaptation. We also have changes in response to things like heat and cold. That might be heat shock proteins, that might be altering the amount of soluble and unsoluble nutrient acquisition, altering water polarity structures, or it might be something like altering of the saturated and unsaturated fatty acids in the cell membrane. So all of these structures can exist. Outside of the stress response, plants also respond to attack. Herbivory is when animals eat plants. Of course, it's a stress for plants. And because these structures are different from organism to organism, they've evolved different ways to respond. It might be something like a physical defense, like a cactus spine, or it might be a chemical defense, like the enzymes of pineapple or opium poppy and the structures there. It might be something like capsaicin and spicy peppers. Okay. Or it could be something like the parasitoid wasp or some sort of symbiotic relationship. And then even then, it could be something internal, like an immune system response. Plants do have immune systems. It may not be an adaptive one like you might think of in a human, but they do have the sensitive response. They do have immunity genes that can be expressed in response to different types of organisms. All sorts of structures exist and allow plants to respond to signals within their environment, including light and water and heat and attack.